Okay, so sentientism, it's a worldview, and like I say, a good way to pronounce it is sentient with ism on the end. Hopefully that helps you work your way through the 5 syllables. And I summarize it in a sentence that you can see here as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. And for a bit of context, and this is UK focused, as you look at different surveys across the UK, about people's worldviews, religious or non-religious, you'll find different answers about non-religious worldviews. But this British Social Attitude Survey is roughly indicative. They tend to show that about half of people in the UK say now that they have no religion. But at the same time, it's important not to jump to too many conclusions from that statement, because it still leaves open a dazzling variety of different worldviews, many of which can still include spiritual or supernatural or even religious aspects to them as well. So this simple, non-religious bucket, if you like, includes a dazzlingly pluralistic range of views. And what I think those of you who work in classrooms will find is whether kids come from a religious background or a non-religious background, there are certain themes that run through their lives today and the things they're thinking about. And part of my pitch around this sentientism idea is I think it's very relevant to many of those different themes. So kids are clearly deeply concerned with questions of identity, diversity, and discrimination. They are very concerned, and some rightly feel some fear around the environment and climate challenges that we're facing. Given how immersed they are in social media, many of the problems of misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracism, which are old problems, have got a new cast in this somewhat dazzling and dizzying age of social media. And, we adults might look on that with some shock or horror, but the kids are actually living it day to day and swamped in this stuff. Topics around animal ethics and veganism are coming up more and more, partly just because they're being talked about more in the zeitgeist generally, but also because kids, particularly the younger kids, identify with these issues very personally through the animals that they might share their own homes with. So these topics have always been resonant, but I think have a particular sort of piquancy and urgency now. Artificial intelligence and technology, again, they've always been challenges, but with GPT-4 and 5 and 6 and artificial intelligence and where it might develop, people are concerned both about the risks those technologies present to us, but also some of the ethical implications as well. And again, I think kids with both religious and non-religious worldviews, until maybe some aspects of our society tries to crush it out of them, they all share this sense of wonder, awe, and curiosity about the world that I think modern RE teaching really wants to foster and encourage and help develop. And hopefully you'll see as we go through this how I think the sentientism worldview plays into some of those themes. So I should explain what it is. It is a worldview. It's a way of thinking. You might describe it as a philosophy of life. And like many religious worldviews, I think it's trying to answer some of the really deep, fundamental questions. And two of my favorites are, what's real? How should we understand the universe we all share? What's the best way of understanding reality and trying to navigate our way through it? But just as importantly, the questions about what matters and who matters, the questions of meaning. What do right and wrong and good and bad actually mean? What does it mean to lead a good life? And in simple terms, I summarize sentientism as a worldview with these 3 words. And in a way, you can take this away as your sort of 3-word summary to remember: evidence, reason, and compassion. So in answering that sort of what's real question, or more technically a sort of epistemological question about how to know things or what to believe, sentientism suggests what I describe as a broadly naturalistic approach, which says let's use evidence and reason to engage honestly with reality, to, with a healthy dose of humility, try and understand it. So when I talk about evidence here, I mean this in quite a broad sense. Yes, it is formal scientific knowledge and people in lab coats doing randomized control trials, but that's not all the evidence. I can look at this mug here and be highly confident it does exist. And I've done no science there at all, right? So evidence can also include the evidence from our senses, from our lived experience, from engaging with others who might have expertise in a particular topic. So I tend to describe evidence as quite a broad, pluralistic way of engaging with the reality. And similarly with reason, this doesn't mean a sort of narrow technical logic. This is all the different ways we might use of thinking carefully, including even sort of intuitive modes of thinking, that we should be humble about our own ability to reason. No one reasons correctly. No one's free of bias. No one's free of cognitive dissonance or wishful thinking. So in a way, reasoning and critical thinking is recognizing those flaws and those problems in our own ways of thinking and using that to be humble about our own conclusions, which should lead us to be comfortable about not knowing things, curious, wanting to find out more, and being ready to change our mind if the evidence changes. So, that's broadly a sort of naturalistic approach to trying to understand the world around us and the universe around us with lots of appropriate humility. And then the ethical question, Sentientism takes quite a pluralistic approach. So many of you who are into philosophy will be familiar with the different approaches to moral philosophy, whether that's rights or deontology or utilitarianism or a feminist care ethic or virtue ethics or something else, or relational approaches. And Sentientism is quite open-minded about all of those things, but it does insist that we're quite clear about who gets to be included in our moral consideration or our compassion. And that's really what the core of this word sentientism focuses on, the concept of a sentient being. Now, sentience, the word comes from the Latin meaning to feel, but in a modern philosophical sense, it really means the capacity to have experiences. Or yes, to feel things, to experience those feelings. And the feelings we're most concerned about tend to be negative feelings like pain and sorrow, or positive feelings like pleasure and joy and love. So they can be really simple, basic experiences, or they can be really rich, complex experiences. But if a being has those experiences and that capacity to feel, they are a sentient being, and they should matter to us. And they should matter to us essentially because they matter to themselves. And in a common sense understanding of morality, if morality is anything, it seems to me to be about whether and how we should care about others, and the choice to care about others. Ultimately, if we choose not to care about others, I would argue that's amoral or even immoral. So it seems to be quite a common sense approach to morality to say, well, if another being can care about and value their own experiences in their own lives, then we should too. And that leads into the journey you can see on the right-hand side, a sort of example way into this topic for an average human animal. I'm sentient, I'm experiencing things. I know I don't like suffering and I do like flourishing. There's lots of evidence out there, both intuitive and scientific, that shows that others, the people on this Zoom call, but many more than that, also don't like suffering almost definitionally and, want to flourish. And if morality is about a moral consideration for the values and the perspectives of others, then we should care about every being that has a perspective, every sentient being. And it suggests that to exclude any sentient being would be arbitrary and not well-founded. So let's make sure they're included in our compassion, and make sure that has a practical aspect as well, in that for the words compassion or moral consideration or care to mean anything at all, at the very least, that should mean we should try to avoid needlessly exploiting, harming, or killing any sentient being. And ideally, we should go beyond that and actually try and help each other flourish too. Now, that sounds quite common sense and quite straightforward, but as we'll come to see, that has some quite radical implications when we think about our dominant social norms today too. So I wanted to explain a little bit about where it comes from. And as I say, it's a new word, but with ancient roots. And this diagram, you can take away and read in your own time, but there's probably three themes I want to pull out here. The first is the central chunk, which starts from the sort of what to believe, what's real question, and starts with this naturalistic approach that uses evidence and reason, that leads many people to atheism or agnosticism. And that naturalistic way of thinking is not a modern invention. This is something that you will find rippling back through history in every human culture. And I would argue even the earliest humans probably had this naturalistic way of thinking. They wouldn't have, been able to express that in a formal philosophy, but I think the earliest humans wandering around the savannah, in a way, were using a naturalistic approach to understand their environment. They're using their senses. They're trying to think honestly about reality so they can continue to survive. So arguably, this sort of naturalistic approach to understanding reality is as old as humanity, and maybe even older than that, because I would argue also that non-human animals today and before humanity evolved, we're also using a sort of naturalistic approach. Again, using senses, doing basic reasoning, trying to understand reality so that you can survive and reproduce. So I guess that is a super ancient way of understanding the world. And now, as we follow that central theme down, humanism takes that naturalistic approach to understanding the world and says, well, okay, that's great as a way of understanding things, but when we're thinking about questions of meaning and morality and ethics, we need a stance here that lays out a basis for our ethics. And humanism, in simple terms, says we don't need a supernatural basis for our ethics. We don't need a God to tell us what's right and wrong. We as humans, as agents, can decide on our own ethics, or we can construct our own ethics, or we can discover our own ethics. And the default stance of humanism is that at least all human beings should matter. So that runs into ideas like human rights and and the default reasonably progressive moral philosophy you might find today that rejects all forms of intrahuman discrimination, caste, looks, sexuality, gender, sexual preferences, race, the list goes on, and says, look, every human being should matter. Not because humanism suggests that only humans should matter, but humanism suggests that we as human agents should grant moral consideration at least to all humans. So that's the first theme. Now, what Sentientism does to that is it takes that stance that we don't need a supernatural basis for our ethics. It takes that naturalistic approach to understanding reality, but it insists that rather than putting humans at the center of our moral scope, we broaden that out explicitly to all sentient beings. And that's partly driven by the left-hand side of this diagram here, where again, you can see another ancient set of ideas about morality that, again, I would argue, go back as deep as humanity itself. So I think it's highly likely that, again, even the earliest humans had some moral sense that non-human animals matter too. I think those early humans probably had that sense in the same way as a 5-year-old child today, when encountering a puppy, just has an intuitive sense that the eyes looking back at you are, part of a being that can experience suffering. So I think this idea that non-human animals should matter is as old as humanity. And you can see, again, that idea rippling through many different cultures over time, whether it's Buddhism, Rastafarianism, Jainism, Greek and Arabic cultures. One example I'd call out that's very relevant to the religious education space is the idea of ahimsa, non-violence or doing no harm. It's very common in the Dharmic religions. And ahimsa doesn't say do no harm to other humans. It says do no harm at all. So by implication, that means do no harm to any being that can be harmed. And a being that can be harmed, by definition, is a sentient being. So in a way, ahimsa is, if you like, a Dharmic religion version of this sentiocentric concern for not just humans, but for any being that can be harmed at all. Now, some of that thinking clearly got formalized in recent decades and centuries, and people will have heard of the work of people like Richard Ryder and the Godloviches and Bridget Brophy and Peter Singer and others, and the development of ideas like, and the popularization of ideas like veganism. But again, they're standing on the shoulders of some very ancient cultural ideas that have been running through lots of different cultures. Sometimes that's forgotten, but we play that in, and that reinforces this idea that, fine, we should understand the world naturalistically, but our moral scope should include all sentient beings, not just humans. And if you want to get a little bit sci-fi, there's the right-hand side of this diagram where people, whether in futurists or technologists or sci-fi authors, have been thinking for a long while about non-human, but even non-biological sentient beings, with the worlds of fiction. And maybe as time goes on, as we look at GPT-5, GPT-6, GPT-7, we might get to the point where there are artificial entities that have either been created by humans or evolved by humans that might even warrant their own moral consideration themselves. And again, Sentientism is quite neutral about this stuff. It says that, whether a being is a human or an animal or an artificial intelligence or some alien species, if we have decent naturalistic evidence that gives us a view that they probably are sentient, then we should include them in our moral consideration in it. It would be wrong to needlessly exploit, harm, or kill them. So hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the really deep, ancient, even pre-human roots of this idea. I won't go through this diagram in full, but again, there may be some interesting background reading people can do if they want to dig deeper. But it just lays out how sentientism as a worldview is a little bit different from some of the other isms you might have heard about. So it's worth spending a moment or two on this balance between humanism and sentientism, because humanism, frustratingly, many humanists seem to think humanism is just about humans, but it really isn't. Humanism isn't about humans as moral patients. It's about humans as moral agents. So as I was saying, humanism says, well, we don't need a God to tell us to be good. We as human agents can decide our own morality, or can construct or can discover it. So humanism already technically can be open to moral consideration for non-human sentient beings. And indeed, many humanists and some of the humanist organizations are sort of slowly edging in that direction, updating their definitions and getting more serious about animal ethics and ideas like veganism. But again, it's slow progress. I still think it's fair to say that the humanist movement today is overwhelmingly centered on humans, and the technical term here is anthropocentric, whereas sentientism explicitly rejects anthropocentrism. It says that every sentient being should matter. And to give you a sense of how radical that is, human beings are a vanishingly tiny percentage of the sentient beings on our planet. It's hard to estimate, but there may be, quadrillion or quintillion or even a sextillion sentient beings just on our planet today, where we include all of the wild free-ranging animals currently under human control in labs and in farms and fisheries, and liminal animals living around and with us, and companion animals too. So humans are a tiny percentage of the sentient beings that are around today, and sentient beings existed for maybe hundreds of millions of years before humans even evolved. So again, it's quite a radical decentering of humans, if you like, and focusing on, all sentient beings matter, all suffering matters, all beings that can suffer matter. So there is still a distinction there. There's a tension. But many people, including myself, would say, fine, I'm a humanist and a sentientist too, whereas other sentientists are so frustrated by the anthropocentrism of humanism that they don't really like the association with the term. It's probably also worth drawing a connection with, down the bottom right, the ideas of veganism and ahimsa there as well, because there is a very strong overlap. And to my mind, sentientism motivates veganism directly, because sentientism says we should have compassion for all sentient beings, and that compassion should be meaningful, such that we shouldn't needlessly exploit, harm, or kill any sentient being. And veganism is a philosophy that basically takes that stance and says that the human exploitation, harming, and killing of animals is a moral wrong, and we should do what is practicable and possible to try and avoid causing that, in the same way as ahimsa as an idea is about doing no harm. So I think there's a couple of distinctions that I'd make here. One is that sentientism focuses on this concept of sentience rather than the term animal, which is a biological taxa. In practice, they overlap enormously, because modern scientific evidence is very strong that very, very many types of animals, certainly all vertebrates, and very many of the invertebrates, have a decent chance of being sentient, and we should give the benefit of the doubt to the others too. So in practical, there isn't much difference, but sentientism focuses on the capability and the characteristic rather than a particular biological classification, if that makes sense. In the same way as ahimsa does, it says do no harm to whoever. It doesn't just say do no harm to animals. The other thing I'd say is that veganism and ahimsa are generally about not harming others, but sentientism has a broader concept of moral consideration, which can also imply that we should be not just non-maleficent, we shouldn't just avoid doing bad stuff. We should maybe also be benevolent and try and go above and beyond that. So that introduces a concern for suffering in the lives of beings, whether or not they're being oppressed or exploited by humans. It's a much broader concept than that. And finally, it's also explicitly naturalistic. So whereas ahimsa comes out of the Dharmic religions and veganism is quite neutral on your epistemology, I think most vegan arguments are based on a naturalistic scientific understanding of the world, but there are very many vegans with a supernatural or a spiritual worldview. Sentientism is explicitly naturalistic, and we can dig into why I think that's an important distinction to make later, if that's useful in the discussion. So a couple of thoughts before we go into the discussion about how we might integrate this into teaching in the RE or RWE or RVE worlds. And again, there's a bit of a UK bias here. One, I think it's aligned with quite modern religious education objectives that come through the religions or worldviews approach that the REC is developing. But also just because of, from talking to many RE teachers and professionals, the objectives we have for the classroom include, we want our kids to be coming out thinking critically, understanding the worldviews of others, and having a pluralistic ability to live in a multicultural, multi-religion and multi-faith and multi-belief and multi-worldview society. But we also want them to have the confidence and the freedom to explore their own paths too. And in a way, sentientism helps us hit those topics directly, because the commitment to a naturalistic epistemology is central to this idea of critical thinking. And the philosophical depth that, Ofsted in the UK, again, is trying to push the RE topic to achieving is addressed directly by the fact that sentientism, that's all it really talks about. It talks about those deepest philosophical questions of epistemology and of ethics. So it's quite a useful way of appreciating that depth and digging deeper as we're talking about all sorts of different worldviews. I also find from my work in the classroom that it is a great open gateway to the sciences, social sciences, humanities, and philosophy. So, when I talk as part of doing workshops around sentientism, and I talk about the fact that, I think as a result of my naturalism that there probably isn't a God, kids quite often in an RE context will jump into amazing questions like, okay, well, where did humans come from, or where did the universe come from? So it's fascinating to admit that because I'm a good naturalist, I don't know the answers to those things, but let's go and find out by exploring physics and biology. And, we can have some mind-blowing discussions about the different ideas physicists have about what happened before the Big Bang, or we can talk about the implications of evolutionary biology, that the banana you had for lunch is, a distant cousin. So I just love that sort of, you can open kids' minds up into topics for them to go and explore, rather than present, a closed answer to those types of topics. And I think it does resonate with some of the themes we touched on before. Sentientism gives you an explicit rationale for rejecting discrimination, right? Because it's, instead of saying, here's a list of discriminations that are bad, it says every sentient being warrants serious moral consideration, and that's why we should reject the discrimination. It feeds into the environment and climate topic because partly our environmental concern is also about our concern for the well-being and lives of all of the wild sentient beings that live out there, but also because of the catastrophic impact of animal agriculture and exploitation on the environment and climate topic. So it plays in there. The misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracism themes run from this idea about using evidence and reason and critical thinking. Who should we trust? How confident we should be? How do we manage those risks in today's society? Of course, animal ethics and veganism play through, because again, it gives you a really strong philosophical basis for addressing those sometimes contentious questions. It also plays into the AI and technology space, because again, many kids will have heard about, is artificial intelligence a threat to us, either existentially or in terms of jobs? But they'll also be interested in, at what point might Alexa advance to such a point where you should care about Alexa and be polite to them? And again, sentientism gives you a way into some of those fascinating topics too. And finally, that, wonder, awe, and curiosity point, this naturalistic approach to being uncertain. It's okay not knowing, but let's be curious and go and find out, I think plays really well too with many of the young people I've worked with. And again, some final thoughts about how to do this. When you hear the word sentientism and you understand some of the philosophical concepts, you might immediately think, well, maybe this is better for older kids. I'd have to tune this in a certain way. But in my experience, we can engage on these topics and the sentientism worldview from the very earliest ages all the way through, just by choosing the sorts of entry points and the inquiry questions we want to ask. So I've had some fascinating conversations, even with early years kids, by asking questions about how can we work out what's true? How sure should I be that I'm right? Is it okay to say I don't know? Who should we trust? And on the ethical front, just asking basic questions. Who should we care about? Your family, your friends, your classmates, all humans, non-human animals. How far does it go? Artificial intelligence is, again, even the youngest kids can really engage as mini philosophers on these topics. So that can be super powerful at the younger ages. As you go into the older age groups, again, you can use it as a bit of a launch pad for thinking about epistemology and moral philosophy, because you can talk about the different types of epistemology. You can talk about revelation and fideism and different forms of dogma. You can talk about different varieties of naturalism and the risks within them and the risks of scientism, for example. On the moral philosophy point, you can say, well, there's loads of different ways of putting our care or our compassion into practice. What about rights? What about utility? What about feminist care ethics? So again, it's a launching pad for moral philosophy too. And then with some of the older kids, you can then start to run through the implications of this worldview. So like many other worldviews, you can describe it in quite a simple way, but the implications for every domain of human thought, whether that's rights, politics, economics, the sustainable development goals, language, law, actually get a radical revamp if you apply and run this sentientist worldview through it. So we've done some fascinating experiments which you could replicate in the classroom, of taking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and rewriting it as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. Or you can take the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and rewrite those from a sentientist perspective that doesn't just focus on humans worrying about our environment. It opens our eyes up to all sentient beings. It thinks about politics. What would politics look like if we really took, animal ethics seriously? Would we have non-human animal representatives in our parliaments, as an example? So there's a whole world of different implications and interventions you can dig into. And that leads me back to the curriculum options, which I'll finish up with here, because I'm very aware that, all around the world, but certainly in the UK, these topics are under enormous pressure. There's a lot of focus on, maths and English and covering the basics. There's some uncertainty about the value of RE in a modern world, which I think is poorly founded, but, it's there. The space is under-resourced. It's hard to bring the right talent in. It's hard to get the right money. It's hard to get enough hours in the week. So it may seem a little bit ridiculous to say, okay, what you really need is yet another worldview. That's probably not what you need. But I think there's some options here that hopefully might be useful, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, because yes, you can cover this in full depth as a worldview. You can cover the basics, run through all of the things I've talked about in terms of implications and options and varieties, and how it radically clashes with many of our current social norms around animal agriculture and various other aspects. But you can also address it alongside humanism. So if you're talking about non-religious worldviews and you focus on humanism as your non-religious worldview of choice, you can lay sentientism against that and talk about it as a variant or an upgrade or an extension of humanism, and say, well, here's a real challenge. Maybe humanism's becoming its own dogma. Is sentientism the next level? You can cover it in a single lesson. So that's most of what I've done in classrooms so far, again, from A-level kids all the way down to 5- and 6-year-olds, is just cover the basics, because evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings is really easy to explain to kids in a minute. And then you can structure a single lesson just to sort of spark some ideas around that. But I think I'd also make an appeal that even if you don't address sentientism explicitly as a non-religious worldview, that these ideas can be embedded into and used as challenges in all of the other worldviews, religious and non-religious. I often find that epistemology itself is a bit neglected. We might go through, here's the things people believe, but we don't spend enough time talking about, and how do people choose what to believe in that worldview? So I think actually addressing that epistemological question, how do we know, who should we trust, how can we be sure, is a really important complement to here's a list of beliefs. And another area which I find sorely lacking, because our culture is very human-centric, is these questions about animal ethics and veganism. You can address them in every worldview. In Christianity, yes, there are ideas about dominion over animals, but is that really meant in a way that we can harm them needlessly? What about us being stewards of God's creation? Wasn't the Garden of Eden vegan? When you talk about the Dharmic religions, it plays in there very directly too, because of the ideas of ahimsa and do no harm. And what's happened to that idea in the modern world, where even many people who say they, aspire to ahimsa still needlessly cause egregious suffering to non-human animals, even if it's secondhand through a different industry. So I think those topics of epistemology and animal ethics, you can introduce those as challenges and extensions into every worldview you cover. So I will stop talking there, but when I wrap up, I'll come back to this page, because there's a bunch of different resources and materials that you might find useful. I'm very happy to send this PDF around, and all of these links are clickable, so you can click through and explore this stuff if you're interested in finding more. So I will send that around to everyone who's signed up. But for now, let me stop sharing